The sun hung low over the savannah, casting long shadows of towering baobab trees that stood like silent sentinels of time. The trees whispered in the evening breeze, their gnarled branches heavy with the secrets of generations long past. Below, the red earth glowed with the fading light, and the soft hum of the village filled the air, a melody of life uninterrupted by time. Children's laughter mingled with the distant rhythm of drums, a sound that reminded the villagers of their ancestors' eternal presence. Nestled at the edge of the village stood a collection of mud brick homes, each built with care and tradition. The homes, small but sturdy, bore intricate patterns pressed into the clay, a mark of the family's lineage and their place within the community. Elders sat on woven mats outside their homes, sharing tales of trickster spirits and brave warriors, while women balanced water pots on their heads, their footsteps steady and deliberate. Life in the village was simple but sacred, bound by rituals and unspoken rules that had guided their people for centuries. Among these homes was one that stood apart, not in size or design, but in the weight it seemed to carry. Abeni's house was a modest structure, its mud walls smoothed by years of care. Yet it was the door at the back of her kitchen that caught everyone's attention. A heavy wooden door, blackened with age and secured by an iron lock, stood closed at all times. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the cursed door. Children dared each other to touch it and fled, giggling nervously, while elders warned that some secrets were better left undisturbed. Abeni, the widow of the late Oba, was no stranger to whispers. Her husband, once a revered hunter, had vanished one night under mysterious circumstances. Since then, Abeni had carried the weight of his absence and the responsibilities of raising her 2 children alone. Her days were spent tending to her small garden and weaving mats to sell in the market. But her nights were filled with restless gazes at the locked door. The villagers respected her resilience, but also feared her. They spoke of her spiritual connection, how she seemed to know things others did not, how her eyes often carried the glint of wisdom beyond her years. Abeni is touched by the ancestors, some would say. Others, less kind, whispered, she is guarding something that should not be. Her children, Dayo and Sade, often caught her staring at the door, a distant look in her eyes. Mama, Dayo once asked, why do you always look at that door? But Abeni would only shake her head and murmur, some things are better left alone. The more she guarded the door, the more it seemed to attract the attention of the village. The rumors began quietly at first. That door leads to the spirit world, one elder said, shaking her head as she spoke. It is a portal, and Abeni knows it. Soon, the whispers grew louder. Children dared each other to touch it, only to run away when the winds seemed to shift ominously around them. Elders began to share old tales of families destroyed by secrets too heavy to bear. Baba Kofi, the oldest and most respected elder in the village, visited Abeni one evening. He walked with the aid of a crooked staff, his eyes clouded but sharp. Abeni, he said, his voice low but firm. The ancestors are restless. The whispers of the villagers have reached their ears. What lies behind that door must not stay hidden forever. Abeni's face tightened. What lies behind that door is not for them, Baba Kofi. It is my burden to bear. But for how long, Abeni? Secrets buried too deep will one day claw their way to the surface. Do not let your silence be the doom of your family. Abeni said nothing, her hands clutching the talisman that hung around her neck. A small object carved from ebony, worn smooth by years of touch. As the elder turned to leave, she whispered, I will do what I must to protect my children. That night, as darkness enveloped the village, Abeni stood alone in her kitchen, her gaze fixed on the door. The air felt heavy, and the talisman in her hand grew warm. Then faintly, she heard it. A sound like the distant beat of a drum, slow and rhythmic, coming from behind the door. Her breath hitched, and she clutched the talisman tighter. The ancestors were speaking, but what they said, only Abeni could understand. The sound faded, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Abeni turned away from the door, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the past was stirring. Whatever lay behind that door, she knew it would not remain hidden for much longer. The moon hung high in the velvet sky, its light casting long, silvery shadows on the village below. Dayo sat on a low stool outside his home, staring at the ground, lost in thought. The faint hum of crickets filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a web of unanswered questions. The locked door loomed large in his thoughts, its presence gnawing at him like a persistent drumbeat. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Why does she never tell us? Dayo muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. What is she hiding? Sade, his younger sister, emerged from the house carrying a small basket. She paused when she saw her brother's tense posture. "What's wrong, Dayo?" she asked softly, setting the basket down. Dayo glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and despair. "Don't you ever wonder, Sade, about father, about that door?" She says nothing, but I can feel it. The answers are there. Sade hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her dress. "Mama says we must not ask about the door. She says it is a burden only she can carry." "And you believe her?" Dayo shot back, his voice rising. "She keeps us in the dark, while the whole village whispers about us. They say we are cursed, Sade. They say father's spirit." He stopped himself, lowering his voice. "We deserve to know the truth." Sade bit her lip, torn between loyalty to her mother and the growing curiosity planted by Dayo's words. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "What if the truth is too much for us? What if it's better not to know?" Dayo shook his head. "I can't accept that. I'm going to find out what she's hiding. Will you help me?" Sade hesitated, but the intensity in her brother's eyes pulled her in. Slowly she nodded. "I'll help," she said, though her voice trembled. "But only because I want to protect you. If this gets out of hand, we stop." Inside the house, Abeni sat by the hearth, the flickering firelight casting shadows on her tired face. She held the talisman tightly in her hands, her lips moving silently in prayer. The warmth of the fire did little to ease the chill that had settled deep in her heart. She could feel the weight of her children's curiosity pressing against her, like an unseen force. "Oba," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What should I do? They are asking questions I cannot answer. I fear they will open the door, and the burden you left behind will destroy us all." Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She turned to see Baba Kofi entering, his staff tapping lightly against the floor. His old eyes scanned her face, filled with both pity and concern. "Abeni," he said, his voice low and measured. "The whispers are growing louder. The villagers are restless." "I know," Abeni replied, her tone weary. "But they do not understand. If they knew what lay behind that door, what Oba did, they would cast us out." Baba Kofi leaned on, his staff, his expression grave. "Secrets are like seeds buried in the earth. If you do not tend to them, they will grow wild and unruly. You must act before it is too late." Abeni looked away, her grip tightening on the talisman. "I cannot. The truth would destroy my family." "The truth may hurt," Baba Kofi said, "but lies fester. You carry the weight of this alone, Abeni. But how much longer can you bear it?" Abeni said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Later that night, as the village settled into quiet slumber, Dayo crept toward the locked door. A lantern in hand, he studied the ancient wood, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran his fingers over the surface until they caught on something, a strange mark carved into the door. Leaning closer, he traced the symbol with his fingertip, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. "What is this?" he murmured, the glow of the lantern illuminating the sigil. Sade appeared behind him, her voice shaky. "It looks like one of the symbols Baba Kofi showed us in his stories. It's the mark of judgment." Dayo's eyes widened. "Judgment by the ancestors," he whispered. "This door, it's more than just a door." The next day, Abeni was summoned by the village council. She stood before a circle of elders, her chin held high despite the tension in her shoulders. Baba Kofi sat among them, his gaze fixed on her. "Abeni," one elder began, his tone stern, "the whispers about your house have become impossible to ignore. The ancestors' peace is disturbed, and the village is uneasy. We demand to know the truth about that door." Abeni's jaw tightened. "The door is my business, not yours." The elder's eyes narrowed. "Secrets have no place in a community. If you do not tell us what lies behind that door, we will have no choice but to cast you out." Abeni's voice rose, firm and defiant. "You do not understand the burden I carry. What lies behind that door is not for you to know. It is my family's curse, and I will bear it alone." The council exchanged uneasy glances, their authority challenged. Baba Kofi finally spoke, his tone gentle but firm. "Abeni, the weight of this secret is crushing you. Do not let it destroy your family as well." Abeni said nothing, her silence heavy with unspoken truths. That night, the house grew cold despite the warm air outside. Shadows flickered unnaturally across the walls, and a faint whisper echoed through the halls. Dayo and Sade sat together, their breaths shallow. "Did you hear that?" Sade asked, clutching her brother's arm. Dayo nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. "It's him," he said, his voice barely audible. "Father!" The whispers grew louder, a low murmur that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The siblings huddled together, their curiosity now mingled with fear. "We have to know," Dayo said, though his voice trembled. "We have to." Sade looked at him, her eyes wide. "And if it's something we cannot handle," Dayo swallowed hard, his determination unwavering. "Then we'll face it together." The house fell silent once more, but the unease lingered like a shadow in the corner of their minds. The night was still, but the silence felt heavy, pressing against the walls of the house like an unseen force. Dayo sat in the corner of the kitchen, his eyes fixed on the locked door. The lantern beside him flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. Sade stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself, as if shielding herself from the chill that had nothing to do with the air. "We have to know, Sade," Dayo said, his voice firm yet trembling with the weight of his own fear. "This door, it's the key to everything, to Father, to the whispers, to why the villagers look at us the way they do." Sade's voice was soft, but edged with worry. "Mama said we must not." She said, "I don't care what Mama said." Dayo snapped, standing abruptly. His shadow loomed large against the wall. "She's hiding something. Something important. Don't you want to know what it is? Aren't you tired of living in the dark?" Sade hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her dress. She looked at her brother, at the determination in his eyes, and sighed. "If we do this," she said quietly, "there's no going back." Dayo nodded. "I know." They moved toward the door, the old wood seeming to breathe under their touch. Dayo retrieved a small crowbar he had hidden earlier, his hand shaking as he wedged it into the frame. With a grunt, he pushed. The door creaked and groaned, resisting as though it had been alive. But finally, it gave way with a shuddering crack. The siblings stepped inside, the air changing instantly. It was cold, unnaturally so, and heavy with the scent of earth and something metallic. Shadows danced on the walls, though there was no light to cast them. Sade shivered, clutching her arms tighter. "Dayo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." "Neither do I," he admitted, but he pressed forward, his lantern held high. In the center of the room sat a large blood-stained drum. Its surface was cracked and dry, the deep red stains etched into its skin like scars. Nearby, bones wrapped in faded cloth lay in a careful pile, their presence both reverent and horrifying. And then there was the talisman, Abeni's talisman, glowing faintly on a small altar. The glow pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, casting an otherworldly light across the room. "What is this?" Sade whispered, her eyes wide. "Dayo, what have we done?" Before Dayo could respond, the room seemed to exhale, a low guttural sound rising from the shadows. The air thickened, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The drum, untouched, began to beat, slowly at first, then faster, each strike reverberating through their chests. "Run!" Dayo shouted, grabbing Sadie's hand. They stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind them. But the sound of the drum did not stop. It grew louder, accompanied by whispers, low and guttural, speaking a language neither of them could understand. The house shuddered, its walls seeming to warp and twist. Shadows stretched unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled clawed hands. The whispers became a roar, and the air filled with the scent of burning wood. Far away, Abeni was returning from the village meeting when she felt it, a sharp, piercing pain in her chest, followed by a cold wave that nearly knocked her off her feet. She clutched the talisman around her neck. Its warmth gone, her heart sank. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She dropped the basket she was carrying and ran, her bare feet pounding against the dirt path. The sight of her house sent a chill through her. Its walls glowed faintly, the light pulsing like a heartbeat. She could hear the drum beats from inside, deep and menacing. Abeni burst through the door to find her children huddled in the corner, their faces pale with terror. The whispers filled the room, now louder than ever, and the shadows twisted and writhed like living creatures. "What have you done?" Abeni cried, her voice breaking. "Mama, we didn't mean," Sade stammered. But Abeni silenced her with a look. She turned to the door, now shaking violently, as though something on the other side was trying to break through. "It is too late," Abeni murmured, tears streaming down her face. "You have awakened the spirit." She moved to the door, her hand gripping the talisman tightly. "Oba," she whispered, her voice filled with pain. "I told you this day would come, and now I must finish what you could not." "Mama, what are you talking about?" Dayo cried, standing. "What spirit? What is happening?" Abeni turned to her children, her face etched with sorrow. "Your father broke the sacred laws. He hunted the forbidden animals, defying the ancestors. When the wrath of the spirit came, he offered himself to save us. This door was his prison, a seal to keep his restless spirit from destroying us all. But now," she gestured to the glowing walls, her voice trembling, "now the seal is broken." "Mama, no," Sade sobbed. "There must be another way." Abeni smiled faintly, her tears glistening in the dim light. "There is no other way, my child. The spirit demands balance, and I will give it." She moved to the altar, lifting the glowing talisman. The light grew brighter, enveloping her in a warm, golden glow. The whispers grew quieter, the shadows retreating as the spirit's attention focused on her. Abeni raised the talisman above, her head, her voice steady, despite the fear in her heart. Ancestors, I offer myself to you. Spare my children. Spare this village. Let my sacrifice bring peace. The light engulfed her, and the drumbeat slowed, then stopped. The house fell, silent, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. Abeni's body crumpled to the ground, the talisman still glowing faintly in her hand. Mama! Dayo and Sade rushed to her side, their cries echoing in the now quiet room. But Abeni's face was peaceful, her sacrifice complete. Outside, the villager woke to the stillness, sensing that something profound had occurred. Baba Kofi stood at the edge of the path, his head bowed in respect. The balance had been restored, but the cost would never be forgotten. The golden light of the talisman began to fade, its glow soft and warm as it rested in Abeni's trembling hands. She knelt on the floor, her body weak, her breath shallow. Dayo and Sade crouched beside her, tears streaming down their faces as they clung to her arms. Mama, please, Sade sobbed, her voice breaking. Don't leave us. We didn't mean for this to happen. Abeni smiled faintly, her gaze softening as she looked at her children. Her voice, though faint, carried the strength of her love. My children, she said, do not cry for me. What I do for you, and for our village. The ancestors are watching, and they demand balance. Dayo gripped her hand tightly, his own voice shaking. We didn't understand. We didn't know it would be like this. Mama, forgive us. Abeni placed her free hand on his cheek, her touch gentle. You were curious, Dayo. You wanted the truth, and there is no shame in that. But the truth comes with a price, one that I must pay. Her gaze flicked to the talisman. This talisman has held our family together, binding the spirit of your father so it could not harm you. But now it is time for peace. She turned her face upward, her lips moving in a whispered prayer. Ancestors who walk between the stars, hear my plea. Forgive my family for the sins of the past. Protect my children from harm, and guide this village with wisdom. Take my spirit as a bridge for peace, and let no more pain come to those I love. The air in the room shifted, the heavy, oppressive weight lifting. The whispers faded, and the light from the talisman grew brighter one last time, before extinguishing altogether. The house fell silent, and the shadows that had once clawed at the walls disappeared into the stillness. Abeni's body relaxed, her head tilting gently to one side as her eyes closed. The faint smile on her lips lingered, her expression one of peace. Mama! Sade's voice was barely audible as she cradled Abeni's lifeless form, her tears soaking the fabric of her mother's dress. Outside the house, the villagers gathered, drawn by the strange light they had seen and the vibrations they had felt beneath their feet. Baba Kofi stood at the front of the crowd, leaning heavily on his staff, his face grim but understanding. She has done what only the bravest among us could do, he said softly. Abeni has restored the balance. The murmurs of the villagers grew louder, many expressing shame for their earlier suspicions and judgments. We doubted her, one man said, shaking his head. We thought she was cursed, but she carried this burden to protect us all. She was stronger than any of us, added another. We owe her family our respect and support. Baba Kofi raised a hand, silencing the crowd. It is not enough to speak of respect. Actions must follow words. The children must not bear this burden alone. We are their family now, bound by the sacrifice of one who gave her all. In the days that followed, the village came together to rebuild what had been broken, both within Abeni's home and within their community. Dayo and Sade, though grieving, found solace in the support of their neighbors. Baba Kofi took them under his wing, teaching them the traditions of their ancestors and the delicate balance between respecting the old ways and embracing the future. You must remember, Baba Kofi told them one evening, as they sat by the fire, tradition is like the roots of the baobab tree, deep and strong, but a tree must also grow new branches to reach the sky. It is your task to honor what came before while finding new ways to thrive. Dayo nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Mama always said the ancestors were watching, he said quietly. Now I understand what she meant. They are not just watching, they are guiding us. Years later, Dayo sat with his own children, beneath the shade of a baobab tree, the same talisman resting around his neck. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. His voice was steady as he recounted the story of his mother's sacrifice. She was the strongest woman I have ever known, he said, his tone filled with both pride and sorrow. She carried a burden so heavy it could have broken her, but she bore it with grace and love. And when the time came, she gave everything to protect us. His youngest child, wide-eyed with curiosity, leaned closer. Papa, what did the ancestors do when she gave her life? Dayo smiled faintly, the memory of that moment still vivid in his mind. They restored the balance. The whispers stopped. The shadows disappeared, and peace returned to our home. But they did not take her love from us. That, my child, remains in every breath we take. The child tilted her head, frowning slightly. Will the ancestors ever need more from us? Dayo shook his head. Not if we live with honor and truth. Secrets are heavy burdens, but understanding them is the key to freedom. That is the lesson my mother left for us, and it is one we must never forget. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family sat in silence, the story weaving itself into their hearts. The light faded, but the love of Abeni and the strength of her legacy shone brightly within them, a reminder that redemption and sacrifice are the roots from which all greatness grows.